What would life be without the internet? These days, the very infrastructure underpinning it is increasingly under threat. But how many of us actually stop to consider how or why the internet works? I'm Jennifer Strong, and this is Shift.
Now here on the steering column is a device called Auto Cruise. You simply set the speed you want.
Self-driving robo-taxis are already on the road in 2 U.S. cities.
As the disk rotates, a mirror reflects the light in the way that depends on how the signal was recorded.
This is the 100 terabyte I present to you Electro, the Moto Man.
Ladies and gentlemen.
I would say that one of my greatest skills is my ability to interact with humans.
This episode, we take a look at the future of the internet in part one of a two-part series.
I am Andrew Sullivan. I'm President and CEO of the Internet Society. We work to make sure that the Internet is for everyone. So our goal is to try to ensure that the Internet is strong and also that it is available to everyone. Almost a third of the world's population doesn't have Internet access today, and fewer people are having unfiltered access to it every day of the world. So we're trying to work on both of those issues. You know, when I first connected to the internet, the basic situation was that if you asked somebody whether they wanted a connection to the internet, they would either ask you what was the internet or they would say yes. Everybody understood that this was a tremendous tool of human communication where you could reach out beyond geography and really connect with people in a fundamental way. We're not in that world anymore. A lot of people think the internet was a bad idea. There are a lot of people who are afraid of it, who think that it is super dangerous, that it needs to be controlled. There are a lot of governments who think the internet is a terrible idea because it allows people to speak without any kind of filter between them and the world. There are a lot of corporations who want to own the whole thing. They want to own your entire experience from top to bottom and don't want you to leave their walled garden out into the big wide internet.
There's a common belief that the internet is like a pipe that goes across the Atlantic or goes around to the Pacific and sends data through. I am Sally Costerton. I'm the Interim CEO and President of ICANN. The internet is a network of networks, and it's evolved over time. It's what we call a bottom-up process. The rules that the world put together in what is called the Tunis Agenda in the United Nations in 2005 said this is how the internet will be governed, not just ICANN, but the internet as a whole. And this multi-stakeholder, everyone will be here. Those policies and procedures will have the hands of hundreds of thousands of people on them from all over the world. So they can never be captured. The internet can never be captured by a single organization, a single government, a single company, a single person. Always been set up to have a distributed, bottom-up, multi-stakeholder governance model. And is the secret of its success.
So the internet originally was a United States Department of Defense project. It came out of an effort called the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or sometimes the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, depending on which year it was. There's either a DARPA or an ARPA. And the original idea behind it, to a large extent, was to save money. ARPA funded a lot of research, and that involved funding a lot of computers. And funding a lot of computers was expensive, and everybody wanted their own. So instead of funding everybody to have every computer, the idea was we'll fund one computer and we'll let people talk to each other and use it. That's if you go back in the documents, that was the reason that the program administrators wanted for it. Of course, the researchers wanted nifty research. They wanted to do interesting network research and so on. And there was a lot of network research going on at the time. A lot of different ideas about how you could put computers together and make them useful. And so this particular effort started in the late 1960s. And not very long into this, they had the ARPANET going and they had it up and running. And this was a particular network that was available only to DARPA or ARPA researchers. So you had to have a relationship with the Department of Defense. Some other network research was going on. There was some in the UK, there was some in Hawaii, an effort called AlohaNet. And all of these efforts, they wanted to talk to each other. They wanted to talk to the different networks. And a couple of the researchers in the ARPA project, Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn, came up with an idea for how you could connect these things together using what came to be called Transport Control Protocol and Internet Protocol, the TCP/IP that we use today. This was the basic idea that you would get this up and running. And over time, this network turned into what we call the internet today. And it's right there in the name, right? Internet. It's a network of networks. So multiple networks all hanging together.
ICANN, it's a not-for-profit organization, makes it possible for your device or platform to connect to any other device or platform on the internet. And it does that through the unique identifiers, we call them. Those are the names. So that's like the domain names. The numbers, which is, of course, as I'm sure your listeners will know, computers can't read names, they read numbers. So domain names are actually numbers. And then protocols. And those are the rules that are put together by the IETF, which is the engineering part of the internet that defines how the traffic moves around the domain name system and actually makes sure that your devices can connect. So those three things, the names, the numbers, and the protocols. And we make that work at a technical level. The second pillar of the operation is to develop the policies and procedures. And let's call those the rules, which this is where the internet users of the world in many different roles, so business community, technical community, governments, that's what we call the multi-stakeholder community, come together, convened by ICANN to develop and work on the rules and processes and protocols that are going to govern how that works in the future and ensures that we can maintain a single, as in, so when you type in ibm.com where you are, and you're in the East Coast, aren't you? And when I type it in London, we get to the same website. And that's the single internet, the interoperable internet. So it doesn't matter where we are in the world, we're all using the same, it's all interoperable, it's all a singular global internet.
The really interesting thing about the internet, technically, is that it isn't a single thing at all. It's a kind of emergent property, like, the traffic on the road. If you talk about the traffic on the road, if you divided the traffic in half, you wouldn't have two traffics. You just still have traffic. And similarly, the internet is this emergent property of all of the networks working together, employing the same fundamental rules, which we call protocols. And those protocols, if everybody implements them the same way, it all just works together. It's almost magic, right? When you hear this, like there's nobody in charge, that's actually the big feature of it, that it allows it to grow and scale and still be quite inexpensive because the system hangs together. When the internet was getting deployed commercially in the 1990s, there were a lot of these online services, what we would call walled gardens, and they gradually succumbed to the advantages that the internet gave, because there were so many advantages that really came from the fact that there wasn't a gatekeeper. And people are trying to reinstall gatekeepers all over the place. That is, I think, bad for the internet, but I also think it's bad for humans, that we are losing the opportunities that the internet gives us because we're closing off the way that individuals can use the internet to their advantage.
When you say to a person in the street, what is the internet? And they look at their phone, probably. They might say, well, it's Apple News, it's Facebook, it's WhatsApp, it's content, is what they're really saying. And specifically content that I use every day, usually for most people on their phone. And they might say, oh, it's Zoom, it's email, they talk about applications and they talk about content. And I like to compare it to the idea of a house. So if you think of the technical layer of the internet as the foundation of the house, you can't see it. It's under the ground, but it's holding the house up. And if you think of the content, that's the bit you can see. But the problem is the foundation of the house holds the house up. If you damage the foundation or you attack or you chip away at the foundation of the house, and that's the internet governance structure and the way that infrastructure is made, the whole internet will come with it. So they're not separate. So the fact that you can't see that part of the internet doesn't mean it's what delivers you the content, basically.
Because the internet is made up of these independent networks, and the independent networks, each one works according to its own rules. When you go on the internet, you have the experience of a single whole, a single seamless whole that all hangs together from your point of view. But underlying all of that are all of these independent networks. Even in every web page, there are many different services that come together to make up that web page that appears to you as one smooth web page that is one service. And this difference means that if we regulate the internet, or if we attempt to control it all through a single legal regime or a single corporate control, we have the possibility that these different pieces will not work together, but will instead work at odds with one another. And over time, what happens is the ability of the internet to present this seamless whole disappears. And what you get instead is a bunch of individual little corners of the internet that don't talk to one another. A way of thinking about this is the way it is when you have different kinds of programs on different sorts of computers, an iPhone versus an Android or something like that. The things that are available to you in one environment are not automatically available in another. And the reason for this is because formally these systems are incompatible with one another. And so you have to get something that is compatible with your own system. The internet doesn't work that way today. And the reason it doesn't is because everybody implements these same protocols, and these same protocols are the thing that allow us to have this smooth operation underneath the hood all the time.
That's what's risky, is if the world doesn't understand the role that technical infrastructure plays in the delivery of the content, then there is a risk that the world's internet users, including those governments and businesses who expect the internet to always be there, always do exactly what it's done for the last 30 years, always be on, always grow, always expand, always be adding new features. But if that technical infrastructure is challenged by accident or by design, then there is a risk it will not be there in the future. And if it's not there, then we don't know what plan B is. This is not like fixing a bicycle. We don't have a convenient pump attached to the bike. I'm not saying the internet was shut down immediately, but the United Nations, as I think you know, are currently in the process of reviewing. They're moving into whether or not to renew the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, which this was what's called the Tunis Agenda. And if that isn't renewed, and there are governments and individuals and organisations who might not want that to be the case, some of them want all the other stakeholders out of the room. Everything in the internet to be governed just by government. So you wouldn't have a say, I wouldn't have a say, businesses wouldn't, nobody would, apart from governments. Because the United Nations is vote-based, it is multilateral. And that doesn't mean it's bad, but in this context, this is not how the internet was set up to be governed. We really don't know if that isn't renewed at the end of 2025, what that means for the future of the internet, but it's very high risk.
If we start to break that by saying, oh, well, people in this jurisdiction are allowed to use these resources, people in that jurisdiction are allowed to use these other resources, then you start to get an internet that isn't smooth at all, but instead it depends on who you are and where you are and what it is you're doing. And so when you see application-specific service bans, like we've seen with TikTok, for instance, or when you see proposals for how you're allowed to regulate speech on your platform, like moderation rules, like we've seen Texas and Florida, or when you see rules about how you must interact with people if they're European or if they're children or whatever, what that gradually does is it puts barriers on the internet. And each provider, each network operator, each person who's providing a service on the internet has to figure out how they're going to comply with those things. And very often what they're going to say is, well, it's not worth complying with this thing because I don't really care about those people, so I'm not going to comply with it. And then the internet is a little bit more fragmented. It's not the same everywhere.
The most obvious way is the unintended consequences of regulation. So you will be aware that since GDPR, the new data privacy regulation came out from the EU, that was the first really major piece of data privacy regulation that's triggered a large amount of other kinds of data privacy regulation in many, many countries in the world. So there's been a really raised awareness since then of governments taking care of their citizens and taking a view that they need to make sure that their citizens' data is being used appropriately and that the citizens themselves have control over how their data is being used. And if you are, and this happens a lot, I have a lot of bilaterals with governments in my role. And what you'll find is that you'll get governments who are consider themselves to be very democratic, very on the side of the internet. But equally, they have every right to make local regulation. I mean, ICANN isn't there to say you can't regulate. You should protect your citizens. Of course, governments can do that. But here's the problem. If you say, well, I'm going to implement this law in country X about data privacy or data management generally that revolves the internet, what a lot of governments don't realise is that the internet infrastructure does not observe national borders. So there is a mismatch, very unintended mismatch, but a mismatch between the way you could actually implement that regulation and how the internet works. And that opens up the risk of a fragmentation and digital islands, because once you say we've got a country internet as opposed to a global internet, you're fragmenting the model and you're starting to separate it out. So that single interoperable nature, which is so hardwired into the design and creation of the internet and so much a part of the success, starts to be put at risk. And so what we're doing at ICANN is doing everything we can with our work with governments. We have 200 governments at ICANN already, to raise awareness of, we're not saying don't regulate, but we are saying before you do, make sure you've tested this and you've understood how it's going to be implemented. You don't accidentally put a chip in that foundation under the house, because that's what can happen.
So the GDPR is a good example of this. The General Data Protection Regulation is an attempt to regulate how privacy works on the internet, and it applies to Europeans. But of course, it applies to Europeans like wherever they are. And so since wherever they are is not really an idea on the internet, it really just applies to the internet. And it's a good idea in principle. Actually, its fundamental design was really the right way to do it. The way that it works is it says, if you have this data, you need to treat it certain ways, and we're going to have big fines if you don't treat it that way. So that was the basic structure of the law. And in that sense, if that were all there was to it, it would be great. But what instead happens is that people write a big, long list of particular rules about how this thing gets implemented. The effect of this is how we've ended up with cookie banners on every site on the internet, telling you, oh, we're using cookies too. Everybody who sees the disclaimer immediately mashes the big X to try to get the disclaimer out of the way, because nobody really cares about this. And the goals of the legislation, which was to reduce the leakage of privacy from these things, it really hasn't been achieved through that particular mechanism. So this is a good example of how it tends to fragment the internet. It tends to undermine the functionality, and it has these consequences where different people have a different experience depending on who and where they are. The internet, for a lot of the people who are making decisions about these matters, whether they're working for a company and trying to make sure that you stay within their environment, or whether they're working for a legislator or a regulator, almost all of those people have internet all the time. In fact, many of them have never been without it in their entire lives. They grew up in an environment where the internet was everywhere. I did not. I'm old enough that I remember when the internet started to become commercially accessible and when people could or could not get internet access. And it is hard to describe how much the world has changed as a result of this tool. But because it has changed so much, it's very easy for people who are making these rules to forget that what they are doing could have these negative consequences. Once you're used to something just being there like air, you forget that like the air could be turned off. And I think that's a really big danger to us here, that we're concentrating only on the negative stuff and we don't actually pay any attention to the advantages that we're getting from this marvelous tool.
Next episode, we explore the role of language and culture on how the internet works. That's coming up in part 2 of our series on the future of the internet. This episode was produced by me and Emma Silikans and mixed by Garrett Lang, with original music from him and Jacob Gorski. Thanks for listening. I'm Jennifer Strong.